For this segment, we're going to take a look at the budget of the United States government and attempt to be able to understand how money is spent and where the revenue comes from. There'll be three separate modules in taking a look at this. The first module will be an overview of the federal budget, looking at the process of how we get the federal budget, what we spend the money on, and then budget deficits and how it affects the overall spending for the United States. Second module will focus on fiscal and economic policy and some of the tools that we're using as a government to be able to deal with fiscal and economic policy. And then finally, we'll take a look at taxation at both the federal and the state and local level, with more of an emphasis on the way that state and local governments deal with taxation because of the fact that there's a wider range of taxes that are used at the state and local level. So let's begin with the idea of the federal budget. So when we look at the federal budget, Congress has to pass the budget and the president has to sign it. The president comes out with a budget usually at the beginning of the calendar year, and it's up to Congress to be able to pass that budget by the end of the fiscal year, which would be September 30th. So the fiscal year for the federal government runs from October 1st to September 30th. It gives them roughly about 7-8 months to be able to pass the budget. And there's a little bit of a structure. They start early in the spring, try to come up with a overall budget plan, and then work on that budget plan throughout the summer as they approach the end of September when the budget should be passed. It hasn't been a regular budget passed in the United States in recent years. Difficult to be able to fund that, but that's the technical model that we use in the U.S. One thing to be cognizant of is the fact that there is not any one single budget as far as the federal government is concerned. Congress passes a series of what are called appropriations bills, and there are 13 of these that are itemized by issue of public policy. So, for example, there are defense appropriation bills, education appropriation bills, agricultural appropriation bills, etc. And these 13 bills are sent from Congress to the president for the president to sign, and as a sum total, they comprise what we would call the federal budget. Now, the president has the ability to be able to veto any one of these individual appropriation bills, but the president has to essentially veto the entire appropriation bills and not just specific portions of them. So back in the mid-1990s, we were in the middle of some serious budget deficits, and we had a former governor and President Bill Clinton, and most governors have a line item veto. Clinton supported the idea of having a line item veto, and Congress passed this and gave President Clinton the ability to be able to line out specific issues of each of these appropriation bills. So say, for example, he went through the entire agricultural appropriation bills, and somewhere in the midst of that, he found a tax break that would only help, say, 3 or 4 farms in the United States. He could have the ability to be able to cross out that spending, and as a consequence of that, cut out the fat of the budget. Now, what was interesting about this was that this went to the Supreme Court. A number of members of the U.S. Senate said that this was unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court found that it was indeed unconstitutional. Not necessarily because the line item veto was a bad idea, but the Supreme Court essentially said basically what Congress did in passing this was they said that they didn't have the ability to be able to control their spending, and that is one of their constitutional powers. So what they did was they voluntarily ceded one of their powers to the president, and without a constitutional amendment, this line item veto was then ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So as it is right now, the president can veto any one of these individual appropriation bills, but the president doesn't have the ability to be able to have a line item veto. Let's take a look at the budget. This is the budget for fiscal year 2016 at the federal level. As you can see, there was $3.9 trillion with a T in spending by the federal government in 2016. With revenues or income of $3.3 trillion. So, adding 2 and 2 together, you'll see that that means that we have $600 billion less in revenues than we have in spending, meaning that our deficit was right around $600 billion in 2016. Now, there's important things that we're going to talk about as we go through here. When we talk about the budget, there is what we can call mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and net interest on the debt, which technically is also mandatory spending. So what are mandatory spending items? Those are those things that have been guaranteed by law, where we set the eligibility limits for people on the basis of certain characteristics that they've had and them paying into a system. So for example, Social Security is the biggest one of these mandatory spending items that we have. People have paid into that system over the course of their career, and when they retire, they're eligible for that. And the federal government can't cut that or can't change that because it's a mandatory spending item. Other major mandatory spending items are Medicare, which is our program for helping older people with health care. Like Social Security, we have taxes that we pay into the Medicare system, and then we're eligible for that once we reach retirement age. Medicaid also is our program for poor people for medical help here in the United States. That also is based on your income. And then finally, there are a bunch of other things in relationship to paying unemployment compensation, retirement plans for federal employees, etc., that are mandatory that we have to pay. So if you take a look at that green section there of the spending, what you'll notice is that about 2/3 of the spending for the federal government goes towards mandatory spending. In other words, about 2/3 of the government is on autopilot. Now, throw in the idea of the net interest, which you see at the top, which is about $240 billion a year. Net interest is really also, in many respects, a mandatory spending, because if we decided that we were not going to pay off our debt or the interest on the debt, the government would be in serious financial difficulties because people would not lend them more money. Now, discretionary spending is that which the government has the ability to be able to fund on an ongoing basis from year to year. Now, what's interesting about this as well is that you'll see that defense makes up about half of discretionary spending at almost $600 billion, and then non-defense comes in about $600 billion as well. So we're looking at roughly $1.2 trillion out of $3.9 trillion that is discretionary spending. Think about this for a second. Defense is very difficult to cut, right? Republicans support it. Democrats don't want to look like they're weak on defense, so they don't want to cut it. So let's just take a look at the non-defense discretionary funding. In sum total, non-defense discretionary funding equals $600 billion. Our budget deficit for this year was $600 billion. In other words, if we got rid of all the spending that is a non-defense discretionary spending, things like transportation, education, health, housing assistance, welfare programs, all this kind of stuff. At the end of the day, what we would see there would be that we could get rid of all that non-defense spending and we could balance the budget. Very unlikely that that's going to happen. Here's just a quick take from the Congressional Budget Office on what it would take to be able to cut some of our government spending over the coming couple of years. If we wanted to get down to the federal debt at its 50-year average, we'd essentially have to raise taxes by 17% or cut spending by 15% every year, which would amount to about $1,900 a person. So very difficult kind of choices coming in here. Now, let's take a closer look at mandatory versus discretionary spending. So in the U.S., our major healthcare programs combined are the most important and most expensive programs that we have. Social Security is the single biggest program, but in total, Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs for health benefits account for about $1.1 billion. As you see, Social Security is divided into two separate programs. One is what we call the old age or survivor's insurance. Generally, this is what you receive depending on when you choose to retire at 62 and a half, 65, or 67. A second part of Social Security is disability insurance for those people that are on long-term disability. That is part of the Social Security plan and part of the money that we pay into our Social Security taxes, but a much smaller part. So in total, Social Security amounts to $910 billion. Then we have other income security programs for poor people in the United States. So there's the Earned Income Tax Credit for those people that have jobs, people that we consider to be the working poor. They can actually receive money back above and beyond what they receive in taxes as a cash benefit when they write their taxes out. There are other things like SNAP, which are programs for what we typically call food stamps, SSI, and other kind of unemployment compensation. Then we also have mandatory spending programs that are in relationship to people that have worked for the government, either as military employees or as civilians, and benefits that are associated with that. Discretionary spending, on the other hand, only totals about a little bit less than 1/3 of overall spending for the federal government. You can see that in the chart up in the top right-hand corner. In defense, that accounts for about half of all the discretionary spending. And then what's interesting is typically those things that we think of as government programs in the non-defense sector are relatively small when you take a look at it. So out of $3.9 trillion, education only accounts for $92 billion, transportation $91 billion, justice $53 billion. And one of the things that Americans tend to have the viewpoint that we spend an inordinate amount of money on is international programming. And you can see here, out of $3.9 trillion, only $52 billion, I know that's still a lot of money, but only $52 billion is for international affairs. Now, thinking about that, we could cut out that entire program and you'd still be left with a $550 billion budget deficit. So it's a relatively insignificant amount of money. Now, looking forward to the next 30 years, how are these various budget deficit items going to affect us? We have at the present time about a $20 trillion budget deficit. What we'll see as we go forward, that there are kind of these big spending programs. So Social Security, healthcare, other non-interest spending, which is discretionary spending, and then the net interest on the debt. In other words, the money that we pay to borrow money on our deficits. And what you'll see is that the long-term trend is that the interest on the debt will actually be the largest growing program for the federal government. As we go forward, just paying for the debt, not paying it down, but paying the interest on the debt will be one of the largest government programs that we have. As you see going forward, unless something's done to help spending or increase revenues, the amount that we will be spending will vastly outweigh the amount that we take in. And we're looking at budget deficits as we get into the 2030s and 40s of over $1 trillion a year, which are extraordinarily high given historical accounts. The worst budget deficit we ever had was in 2009. In the heart of the financial crisis, we had about a $1.1 trillion budget deficit. We've been averaging between $400 and $600 billion in recent years. And as you can see, our deficits tend to go up in times of great national catastrophes, the Civil War, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and also during times of economic turmoil. Now, again, let's get back here for a second to take a look at interest spending on the deficit. What we will see is that currently 7% of all the funding for the federal government goes towards interest on the debt. By the time we hit 2047, 21%, yeah, 21% of all federal spending will go towards paying interest on the federal deficit. To put that in dollar terms, we were looking at in 2015 here from this chart from the Center for Responsible Federal Budget was about $223 billion on the debt. In 2016, it was about, 2017, it was about 241 billion. By the time we get to 2026, we will be looking at, catch this, $800 billion per year that we'd be paying out for interest, which would be higher than what we would spend on defense. Taking a look at the deficit and the amount of debt that's being held, currently it's larger than our entire economy. And you can see here, this very interesting aspect of the debt. Some of it's owned by our governments, and then some of it's owned by the public, and we'll break that down in a minute. One thing to take a look at is that historically what's happened is in the 1980s, we passed a Social Security reform that basically took into account the fact that there would be a bunch of baby boomers retiring and that we need to have Social Security revenue for them when they retire. The federal government basically took that surplus and then bought its own debt. Imagine that. In other words, we ran a deficit. We said to ourselves, hey, why don't I go into my bank account and I'll loan myself some money for the future? So in reality, debt service in 2017 is actually $474 billion if we include the money that we're paying back to Social Security. Now, we've been lucky. As the deficit's gone up, it's actually a smaller percent of total federal outlays. But the reason for that, if we take a look at chart number 2 here on the right, is that we are in a period of abnormally low interest rates. So the average interest rate on public debt in 2017 was only 2.3%, as opposed to the late 80s when it was 8.8%. So we all know from having credit cards and various other things, the higher your percent of interest, the harder it is to pay down what you owe. So right now we're in good shape with low interest rates, but as interest rates go up, we're going to owe more and more on the deficit. Now here's the question, who owns this debt, right? So currently, as of October 2017, there is $20.4 trillion in federal debt. The public owns $14.8 trillion of this debt, and $5.7 trillion is owned by the federal government. Now, in looking at this, what you can see is that there's some rounding there that gets us to that. As owners of the debt, federal government owns about 40%. State and local governments, including their pension funds, own 4.6%, and 30% of the debt is held by foreign governments, 6% by China, and 5.6% by Japan, and they are the two biggest by far. In sum total, something around 40% of the debt is held by people in foreign countries, including individuals. Now, one last thing to take a look at here is that we have a long-term difficulty when it comes to Social Security. As you can see here, the promised benefits do not add up to the dedicated revenue that comes from Social Security taxes. So a number of things are going to happen by the year 2025 for this to be able to work. Either we're going to have to raise taxes when it comes to Social Security. We're going to have to take more money out of our general fund that doesn't come from Social Security, or we're going to have to limit the amount of benefits that people will get. You can't cut the benefits, but what you can do is limit the amount of growth on those benefits. So in total, we've got a relatively bleak picture going forward for the federal government. And we'll come back and see some things related to revenue in another